They were designed to be the best. They met enemies face to face, endured tragedies and enjoyed victories. They went down in history due to the bravery of their crews. They are the ships that deserve to be called naval legends.
In this episode, Cruiser Belfast, the keeper of the Royal Navy's grandeur. In the beginning of the 1930s, the British Admiralty learned that Japan had begun construction on the new Mogami-class light cruisers, which surpassed the British ships of the same type. In London, it was perceived as a challenge and required an appropriate response. However, to create a worthy adversary for Mogami, the British had to approach the limits imposed by international treaties.
Mogami is quite a successful attempt from the Japanese to create something of their own. They managed to do it. However, the cruiser Mogami encouraged other naval powers to break the provisions of the Washington Naval Treaty.
In 1934, British shipyards started the construction of light cruisers, later named the Town class, because all the ships were named after British towns. The further improvement of the project led to the appearance of the two most advanced ships in the class, Belfast and Edinburgh. In comparison with other towns, they had better armament and a more rational armour layout. By many parameters, the British cruisers were on a par with foreign ships of the same type, despite the fact that they were inferior to their main rival, Mogami, in the number of primary armament guns, 12 against 15. The British tried to even the score by developing new artillery systems for main batteries.
They tried to install a 4-gun turret on Belfast and Edinburgh, but the early trials showed that it became very tight. What does this mean? The turret was overcrowded, making the ammunition handling and firing too inconvenient. That's why they gave up on the idea very quickly.
As a result, engineers settled for triple turrets that had a distinctive feature. To prevent the powder gases from affecting the shell's trajectory when all barrels fired simultaneously, the middle gun was moved backwards a little. The Belfast's firepower was reinforced with 6 coaxial dual-purpose artillery mounts, with a caliber of 4 inches. In general, the cruiser was well armed, and her bountiful artillery made up a good part of her displacement. Cruiser Belfast was commissioned on the eve of war on August 3, 1939. But 4 months later, she had to return to dock.
With the outbreak of World War II, Great Britain faced 2 parallel tasks. One of them was habitual, and the British were prepared for it. The second task was uncharacteristic and unusual. Let's start with the latter. It was the underwater war. The British weren't ready for it at all.
German U-boats were causing lots of trouble, but the British were able to sink them. However, the Royal Navy ships faced another enemy, mines. Belfast fell prey to the most dangerous of them, a new German bottom mine.
In 1939, when a mine exploded underneath this engine room, it pushed everything up to such an extent that they had to rebuild almost the entire ship.
when Belfast hit the mine, she not only received a hole in the hull, but she also had her keel broken, and that's a place that is almost impossible to repair. It's a miracle that she remained afloat, and it's a miracle that she could return to her base for repairs.
Over the course of the modernization, Belfast was equipped with modern radar systems, an upgraded gunfire control system, and became almost a meter wider to increase her stability. The specifications of cruiser Belfast after the modernization of 1942. Length 613 feet 6 inches. Beam 66 feet 3 inches. Draft 23 feet 4 inches. Total displacement 14,900 tons. The power plant included 4 turbo-gear Parsons turbines and 4 Admiralty boilers, and produced 80,000 horsepower. The cruiser's maximum speed reached 31 knots after the modernization. Armor. Main belt 4.5 inches. Decks from 2 to 3 inches. Athwartship bulkheads 2.5 inches. Primary armament turrets were protected by armor from 2 to 4 inches thick. Armament. Primary armament. 12 6-inch Mark 23 guns in 4 turrets. Long-range anti-aircraft artillery, 12 Mark 16 cannons in coaxial mounts, caliber 4 inches. Small caliber anti-aircraft artillery, 2 Vickers Mark 6A 8-barrel pom-pom guns, caliber 1.6 inches. 4 single-barrel and 5 coaxial Oerlikon mounts. The cruiser carried 2 triple TR-4 torpedo launchers with a caliber of 21 inches. 3 Supermarine Walrus aircraft were on board to carry out reconnaissance and fire adjustment. Cruising range 12,200 miles at 12 knots. During the repairs, the Belfast's damaged power plant was completely replaced. It was the same as on the other Town-class cruisers. The difference was in its location on the ship and the power produced. According to the project, the nominal output of the power plant was 82,500 horsepower, but the calculation showed that the Belfast's machine power should be decreased to 80,000 horsepower to work more efficiently.
These steam turbines are driven by the superheated steam that is generated in the boilers at 390 degrees centigrade and at 20 atmospheres. This produces enough power to drive the ship, weighing 14,000 tons, through the water at 32 knots, which is about 36 miles an hour or 58 kilometers an hour.
Understanding the threat posed by German U-boats, the British Navy was constantly hunting for them. To oppose enemy submarines, Belfast was equipped with a hydroacoustic system, a load of depth charges, and aircraft. 3 Walrus seaplanes were able to fight submarines, apart from reconnaissance and fire adjustment tasks. They could carry 2 normal or anti-submarine depth charges on each of their wing bomb racks.
And it was designed to be catapulted from between the funnels into the air and then go off and do its tasks. Its tasks were primarily reconnaissance and anti-submarine warfare, but it was discovered very early on that actually the aircraft was very useful as a search and rescue aircraft. Now, once the aircraft had actually finished its sortie, it had to be recovered back on board the ship. And one of the ways in which you could try and ensure that the water wasn't too rough for it to land on was for the ship to do an S manoeuvre, which left a sort of hemisphere of smooth water onto which the aircraft could land. Once it landed, the aircraft then had to taxi up alongside the ship and then be recovered. Clearly, the pilot could not stop the engine until the telegraphist air gunner had actually hooked the jib from the crane, or the hook from the crane, onto the aircraft. So if you can imagine, he was sitting up on top of here with the crane hook coming down towards him in a very rough sea, waiting to hook it on with that propeller going round behind him. A very dangerous job. Once it was hooked on, the engine could be switched off and then the aircraft could be craned on board. They wanted to do it as quickly as possible before the slick that they had created had actually dissipated and the water began to get rough again.
A warship is a complex system, where the main function of its elements, even the tiniest one, is a successful accomplishment of the mission. The British, with their rich naval history, managed to find a balance for all these elements in this military vehicle. Every detail on a warship, from a gun to a sailor's mug, was designed for victory.
When this ship was commissioned in August of 1939, it had a peacetime crew of 761 officers and men. This was not enough to operate all 4 turrets, so when war started, the crew numbers went up to 950. They lived down here in what looked like a crowded accommodations, but this was a standard format throughout the whole of the Royal Navy, hammocks being hung up where they are above the tables. This was a tradition that goes back about 300 years, that they ate under where they slept. Obviously the sailors needed feeding, and this galley supplied over 2,000 meals a day. It's part of the original ship and would provide meals for the sailors: fish, chips, peas, macaroni cheese, jam roly-poly. All these things would be cooked. They sometimes, during World War II, if a mine went off, would cause a loud explosion underwater, which would stun the fish, and they would float to the surface. If they could, they would gather the fish up so that they would have fresh fish instead of the ones from the deep freezers.
Since Nelson's times, the food ration in the British Royal Navy had not been diverse. The food was substantial, but if it remained unchanged for weeks, even a small bar of chocolate or a jar of jam would be precious for any sailor. However, the real emporium of wonders on Belfast was a ship kiosk, where the sailors could purchase delicacies and everyday items.
We are in the NAFI canteen. The NAFI is an organisation that was invented or developed in 1921 by a team of volunteers who wanted to help the Navy, the Army and the Air Force get things that they couldn't get on ship normally. So things like beers, sweets, chocolates, medal ribbons, rulers, pencils, postcards, anything that they weren't issued with. And as a consequence, it developed into an institution and became known by all the members of the British Armed Forces as the NAFI, the Navy Army Air Force Institute, which over the years of service on the ship become a great boost to the morale of the sailors.
There is a saying that perfectly describes military life: an army marches on its stomach. This rule was implicitly adhered to in the Royal Navy as well.
At action stations, if they knew they were going to have a fight, some of the captains would have the cooks prepare sandwiches so that they could eat where they were at their action stations, whether it was by their guns or in the doctor's surgery. The sick bay we have here is from the late 1950s, early 1960s, and would have been similar to the one in 1930s during World War II. The conditions on the ship in the hospitals would be as modern as they could make it, and the sailors would be better off in here normally than they would be in their own hammocks. In times of war, other parts of the ship, especially the officers' mess, would be cleared of all the furniture, and temporary operating tables like the one you can see behind me would have been established around the ship.
Luckily, casualties among Belfast's crew were minimal during the war, even after a bottom mine exploded next to her, which could easily sink the ship with all her crew members. Only 21 people were injured, and only one of them died later in hospital. After repairs and modernisation, Belfast became the flagship of the 10th Cruiser Squadron based at Scapa Flow. The main service areas for the ship were the waters of the Norwegian and Barents Seas.
The two best light cruisers of the British Royal Navy have an interesting history. Belfast comes into commission, hits a mine, and becomes disabled for almost 3 years. Meanwhile, HMS Edinburgh comes into service and fulfills the duties of both cruisers. She escorts convoys, supports Allied ships, and fights against enemy submarines and aircraft. Unfortunately, Edinburgh was sunk with a valuable cargo of gold. However, Belfast returns from the repair docks and takes up the torch. What hadn't been accomplished by Edinburgh was completed by Belfast. They complemented each other. They were like twin sisters, worthy of each other.
When Belfast came into service, she was assigned the most important task in the Royal Navy, which, by the 20th century, had already been performed for 300 years. This task was to defend shipping routes and manage potential threats for transport ships. As a true defender of commerce, Belfast escorted Arctic convoys in the USSR and supported vessels carrying priceless cargo.
I was born in 1940 during the war, yeah. And I always, ever since I was a young person, yeah, I always wanted to join the Navy. And I read stories, and when I was young, I used to read the stories about the heroism of the Russian convoys and other things on ships. But I'm not sure what I was thinking about on the convoys. And about all they could say was, it was rather rough, it was rather cold, and we survived. But they never said much about it, yeah? I always thought, I want to be, I'm going to join the Navy and I'm going to be brave like they are, yeah? So I did.
The rich history of sea battles and high qualification of British sailors were key factors for the great performance of the Royal Navy. The British always acted in a reasonable way, following thorough and elaborate plans. The opportunity to display their courage and bravery was a great reward for British sailors.
The main task in the Army or Navy is fulfilling your mission. No matter how many enemies you destroy, sink, or knock out, you must fulfill your mission. If German ships go peacefully by, nobody will attack them. But if they threaten the convoy, the British, despite the tremendous superiority of the Germans, attacked their heavy warships. They did what they had to. The Germans were astonished and forced to retreat. And the British didn't think themselves heroes. They were just doing their duty. A classic example of warring parties carrying out a mission was a sea battle that took place at North Cape in December 1943. The German battleship Scharnhorst, accompanied by 5 destroyers, was tasked with destroying a convoy. That was her mission. The convoy support ships, including cruiser Belfast, were assigned a mission to defend the convoy at any cost. The British attacked the enemy. They didn't pause. They didn't think about how to show their courage or perform heroic acts. They fulfilled their duty. Of course, they knew that the German heavy ship would destroy them, but they had a mission: defend the convoy. And they attacked the enemy and fought.
For 8 hours, Belfast and 2 other cruisers were chasing and attacking Scharnhorst, which was superior in terms of armament and armor, until the main sea fleet, with HMS Duke of York, came to their aid. The battle at North Cape and the war for the entire Atlantic Ocean was won by the British. The confrontation between Great Britain and Germany during World War II was severe. However, the United Kingdom was the victor, despite the high price they had to pay. The memories of those sailors who endured the ordeal of the northern convoys are still honoured on Belfast today.
The chapel on the ship was put here in the late 50s and 60s and is still in use. The icon of Admiral Yushakov behind me is the connection between Russia and this ship during World War II and the Arctic convoys. Families who have veterans from the Navy that are dying have their ashes scattered sometimes from the back of the ship, and they're allowed in the chapel so they can sit in peace and remember their loved ones.
I joined Belfast just after it came back off its world cruise. When it came back in '62, this country, it wasn't going to be put into reserve, but they gave it a reprieve and made it put it as a flagship for Home Fleet.
By the early 1970s, Belfast was the only remaining British cruiser that participated in World War II. She was going to be sent to the shipbreaking yard, like her fellow ships. However, thanks to the efforts of British veterans and those who were concerned about naval history, cruiser Belfast was saved and left as a memorial to the courage and bravery of British sailors. Today, she holds pride of place at Tower Bridge, in the heart of London.
And I've had a very enjoyable life, and I still am. I'm still serving this ship as Secretary of the Association. And I don't think anybody can ask more than being able to do and achieve what a person wants to do. And that's what I'm still doing.